Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your one-stop shop for all the economic policy developments of the week. Before I introduce my guest this week, here's a quick look at the week's headlines. The PM panel on tax issues recommends the deferment of GAAR by 3 years. As the industry rejoices, Policy Watch gets you an exclusive interview with the man heading the panel. Major Indian carriers hike international fares as well as domestic routes are for up to 1,000 kilometers. And the debate on the use of the cash reserve ratio or CRR rages on as a monetary tool. Governor Suvarao uses humour to diffuse tension. And Sensex touches the 300 mark this week after a rally in the Asian markets. Nifty gains as well. Those were the headlines, and on the show for the first time is Himanshu Sinha, formerly of the IRS and now Counsel on tax issues with Deloitte. Welcome to Policy Watch, Himanshu. We'll go straight into our first story. Of course, we caught up with Parthasarthi Shome, who of course is heading the panel, the PM panel on tax issues and GAAR. Now, the General Anti-Avoidance Rule or GAAR has been the main cause for foreign investors' uncertain outlook on India ever since Budget 2012-2013. The Prime Minister's panel on GAAR and other tax issues has recommended that GAAR implementation should be deferred for another 3 years. We spoke to Parthasarthi Shome, the man at the center of all the action. This is a Policy Watch exclusive. We have with us an internationally renowned economist, formerly of the IMF and now heading the Prime Minister's panel relating to GAAR issues, Mr. Parthasarthi Shome. Thank you so much for talking to Rajya Sabha Television. So my first question, of course, your draft recommendation has created quite a stir in the markets and the industry as well. They've received it very positively. The 3-year deferment of GAAR that you've said, what was the rationale behind it? Was it just to get FIIs back, get the funds back into India? And could you also tell us a bit more about what other recommendations you have?
Well, the deferment, I think, is mainly so that there'll be a level playing field in both sides. On the side of the stakeholders or taxpayers, they will have some time to reorganize themselves, to enter into investments through arrangements that won't come under avoidance rules such as GAAR, and that will take some time because they've already made certain investments and so on. So they are going to be given adequate time to do it. And in the meanwhile, our tax administration will also hone themselves, so to speak, in the overarching tax instrument that is GAAR. And we have to understand that GAAR is different from SAR. SAR is specific anti-avoidance rules where the exact avoidance mechanism is specified in the law, whereas in the case of GAAR, the exact mechanism is not specified. So officers have to really figure out in a very careful fashion whether this is an avoidance mechanism purely to avoid and get a tax benefit, or are there other business elements in it? So it is better to give a little time to them to be able to use this in a very judicious manner.
You also made the distinction between mitigation and avoidance. Was that really important, and how that help?
Yeah. Well, there are kind of 3 types of things in taxation. One is mitigation, second is avoidance, third is evasion. Let's start from evasion. Evasion is basically illegal. So no one disagrees with the fact that that is an illegal activity. Mitigation is the other extreme, where a taxpayer takes advantage of what is expected legally in terms of minimizing your taxation burden, which is called tax efficiency by the taxpayer. So you are, for example, locating yourself in a special economic zone or SEZ, and where the government itself has defined what are the tax benefits that you will get. So if you do that, that is tax mitigation. But tax avoidance is the gray area. That is, you may have create a rather complex corporate structure whereby, given the laws, you are minimizing your taxes, and so you are fulfilling the sort of the form of the law, what is actually in the written law. However, that might not have been the intent of government's legislation. That is a little tricky, and there's a discretion in it, and therefore when you are invoking GAAR, you have to be very precise and you have to be fully aware of what it comprises and whether it is an avoidance which is acceptable or whether it's an avoidance which is not acceptable.
Well, Himanshu, you heard what he said in the first half of that interview. Shome says purely from a tax perspective, they looked at it and treating it like a tax problem. It made sense for recommending the deferment of GAAR for another 3 years. Would you agree with that assessment?
Oh, definitely. I mean, as you rightly pointed out right in the beginning, that the foreign investment had slowed down on account of the introduction of GAAR in the Finance Act. And coupled with GAAR, the amendments, the retrospective amendments that we brought in subsequent to the Vodafone judgment delivered the Supreme Court had really dampened the investor sentiment world over, and Indian economy in general was receiving bad press. And that was reflecting in fall in FDIs, fall in FII funds coming in. So it was absolutely mandatory for the government to take some checks, some change in policy movements, and that was reflected in setting up of this committee. And this committee has rightly and in a very considered manner come up with recommendations which are very welcome by the investors, by the taxpayers, and by all the stakeholders in general. In fact, it is unprecedented in the way in which the consultations took place prior to the recommendations coming out.
Right. They've also come up with the other recommendations as well. He made the distinction between tax mitigation and tax avoidance. He made that really clear, and he said there is a need for the taxman, for the IT department to actually make a distinction before they actually start proceedings again.
Correct. And actually that was the greatest concern in the minds of the investors and the taxpayers, that when GAAR was brought into the law, the way it was drafted, it was really broad, overarching. It gave really sweeping powers to the tax officers to disregard certain transactions and to impose tax liabilities, which would have led to enormous amount of litigation and disputes. And we all know that tax litigation in India goes on for years and does not really come to an end very easily. So it was absolutely necessary to have a relook at GAAR, and Shome committee has spent a lot of time, and I'm really delighted to see the outcome of the committee deliberations, which has come out in a very systematic manner with recommendations to circumscribe the application of GAAR, both in terms of what principles that need to be given, so that the tax officers and taxpayers know in advance that what the principles are, how it is going to be applied, and what are the safeguards. I think these are the three key issues on which the recommendations rest.
Right. Mind you, there are just recommendations. They haven't been accepted yet. There will be public debate on it. They put it up in the public domain as well. But how do you, in case they are accepted, let's just put that hypothetical scenario in front of our viewers. How do you see this, Himanshu, affecting investor confidence? Investors, especially FIIs and foreign investors, have been completely spooked, if I can use that word, ever since the budget announcement by then Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee. In case the recommendation is accepted, after which do you see this as a turning point, after which investors will once again start seeing India as a preferred destination?
I think it is going to have a very positive impact. I wouldn't hazard a guess in terms of a U-turn of stance by the FIIs, but definitely is going to play a very important role in the mindset of the FIIs when they look at India as a destination, as a possible destination, and when they weigh India vis-a-vis other emerging economies like Brazil or Russia or China, then obviously this is one important aspect that will be considered.
Right. We'll take a small break right now, Himanshu. We'll come back, we'll continue with this story and the rest of the interview we did with Parthasarthi Shome. Don't go anywhere, lots more to come on Policy Watch this week. Keep watching. Welcome back to Policy Watch. Let's continue watching what we asked Parthasarthi Shome, who's heading the panel on the PM panel on GAAR and other tax issues. He spoke with us, and this is the second part of that interaction with him. You've recommended that the government abolish all capital gains tax on listed securities. Do you think that'll give out mixed signals, especially to broking firms as well?
No, because it's a very clear recommendation which doesn't confuse with any other matter in the report. We have followed international principles where listed securities in Annex 6 of the report. In fact, we list the countries where the listed securities are exempted from capital gains. And all we are saying is that for India to be and remain internationally competitive, we will exempt them. And similarly for residents, we say it's the same, don't make a difference between non-residents and residents in order to achieve tax neutrality. And we also have to be aware it's not just foreign investors. We have to look very carefully and increasingly at our own Indian investors who are going abroad. Like if you really recall 6 or 7 years ago when they were going abroad, we were very proud. But if they really leave by the droves and look for elsewhere, we have to make a level playing field for them in our own country. And so, GAAR also, therefore, is not just for foreign investors, it's also, I think, equally dominantly for our own Indian investors so that we can make it attractive for them to operate in our own country.
What is the period when you actually give the final report? I think it's September, end of September as well. There is a feeling in the markets especially that a 3-year deferment, if it happens, when it happens, because India, is such a country where people might forget about GAAR altogether and they might just get a free holiday as well. Do you think that, first of all, is what you aimed at, completely doing away with GAAR, and do you think that could happen?
No, not at all. In fact, that is why we have used the word now. And we have emphasized the importance of GAAR. We have said why GAAR is an important instrument, but we also felt that GAAR is such an important instrument that we have to be very perspicacious about preparing for it. And I certainly hope that GAAR will not be forgotten. It is an instrument which all modern tax administrations are now introducing, and 3 years is a time when it really doesn't matter in the history of taxation and the development of the history, the critical mass of the development of the history. You see many countries where pre-announcement has become the norm for major tax policy changes, major regime changes in taxation, and we should now begin to follow that kind of norm.
One last question, sir. We know you're a busy man, but since you've already given the recommendations now, do you think that this will have the desired effect that there was a rationale behind setting up a committee to look into GAAR and tax-related issues? Do you think foreign investors, FIIs, do you think they'll be more positive about coming back to India and investing more?
Well, I think the overall investment climate should be impacted positively as a part of an overall macro environment improvement that Honorable Finance Minister is really already has put in force. So I think that the GAAR matter is a small component of an overall scenario, larger picture, and so it cannot be expected to be the kind of the leading point and so on and so forth. And not only just foreigners, I think it's important to remember that Indian investors also, and GAAR is an applicable tool to both foreign and Indian investment.
Right. Parthasarthi Shome, thank you so much for joining us on Rajya Sabha Television. Well, that was Parthasarthi Shome, of course. Do you agree when he says, I asked him a question and I said, do you think industry watchers, when the announcements came of the recommendations, they were up and about saying, oh, deferment for 3 years, people are going to forget about GAAR and it's going to be dead and buried. Do you agree with that at all, that no one's going to miss it and forget about it? Do you think that's going to be the case?
I think government has now become ambivalent about GAAR, following all the criticism and following the recommendations of the Shome committee. So I think the finance minister is going to have a hard look at the GAAR, and I would not really rule it out that even though there may be a deferment right now, it may not come in the foreseeable future.
So you're not ruling that out now?
Exactly.
It might be difficult, but it's not impossible.
It's not impossible.
Right. One more thing I wanted to ask you, is this part now, the deferment of GAAR, the committee on tax issues, is this part of a larger change that we are seeing, especially in the finance ministry? The new regime is there, Chidambaram has taken over, Raghuram Rajan comes in as chief economic advisor, Shome is a former Chidambaram aide as well. Do you see a major change in the outlook that the government has towards big business, investors? Remember, reviving growth is the top priority as far as government is concerned. Anything short of giving another stimulus package, these are the kind of steps that are going to make all the difference for reviving growth.
Absolutely. I mean, following change of leadership in North Bloc, it is quite clear that Mr. Chidambaram wants a complete shift from the prior positions, and that is being reflected in various committees that have been set up to have a relook at some of these tough tax policy decisions that were taken in the earlier regime. So whether it is the Committee on Taxation of R&D centers, or on issues relating to transfer pricing, or on issues relating to retrospective tax amendments, or on GAAR, all these issues are being re-examined, and which is sent a very positive image to the signal to the investors. So definitely the North Bloc wants in a very positive manner to portray an image that the finance ministry means business. It wants to attract investment. It wants to restore confidence of the foreign investors and domestic taxpayers in the Indian economy.
Right. One last question on this particular story. Parthasarthi Shome also mentioned that not just the foreign investors, not just the FIIs, equally important are our own domestic Indian investors who, like you said, we were proud of them when they went away and invested abroad. They also would like to have a level playing field now. Do you think that's very important, that Indian investors and foreign investors, because of the deferment of GAAR, will have a sort of a level playing field?
Yes. And I think in this respect, the 2 points I would like to mention. First, the point which Dr. Shome mentioned, that he wants to have a balance in terms of equity, tax neutrality between foreign investors and domestic investors. Now, in tax law, in tax policy, this concept of having equity, horizontal equity among various taxpayers who are similarly placed, is considered to be a laudable objective. So definitely, Dr. Shome has got it right when he says that why the preference only for the FIIs? Why not for domestic investors? So he's driven by that fact when he says that please abolish capital gains tax on listed securities, because he wants to deepen the capital markets. He wants to increase participation of domestic investors in the capital markets. So that is one point. And obviously India is competing for foreign funds. So FIIs, they can move funds at will from one country to another. And if you have adverse tax scenario in India, they will move funds outside.
Right.
So clearly, India needs to have a proper investment climate to attract these funds.
Fair point. On that note, we'll take another small break. More with Himanshu Sinha just after the break. Don't go anywhere. Keep watching Policy Watch. Welcome back to Policy Watch now. As the war of words between Pradeep Chaudhary, chairman of the SBI, India's largest lender, and KC Chakravarti, the deputy governor of the RBI, over the need for cash reserve ratio or CRR rages on, the governor of the Reserve Bank, Diveri Subba Rao, used laughter therapy to ease the tension. Shocking reporters in Mumbai recently, Subba Rao remarked that he was constituting a committee with Chaudhary and Chakravarti as members to explore the issue. As we know now, Governor Subba Rao was showcasing his comic skills. But on a more serious note, let's take a look at what costs other emerging economies employ when it comes to CRR. Let's give you graphics on your screen. Let's take a look at the dynamics of the CRR. CRR, or cash reserve ratio, is a slice of deposit that banks have to park with the central bank. Is currently fixed at 4.75% in India. Many countries, but not all countries, use this tool of monetary policy. Notably among them are the US Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England as well. Among the advanced economies, they also use this tool. While the ECB does not pay any interest on such balances, the US Fed and Bank of England pay the Fed funds rate at 0.25% and 0.5% respectively. Now let's have a look at the CRR rates around the world in emerging economies. In South Africa, the rate is 2.5%. In Russia, it's slightly less than India at 4%, while India is around 4.75%. In China, the CRR is pretty high. It's at 20.5%. In Brazil, another emerging economy, 20%. Himanshu, let me ask you this. Let's start at the start in this issue. Should there be even a debate at all at the need to do away with the CRR?
I think this debate is a non-starter because for a country like India, it is absolutely a must to have a provision for CRR, for maintenance of prudential norms for the banks, and for use of CRR as a monetary policy for control of liquidity in the markets. I think it's pretty much acknowledged, and I think it cannot be anyone's case that it should be done away with completely.
So when Pradeep Chaudhary said that there should in fact be a debate, not just a debate, a policy decision should be taken that to do away with the CRR completely, you don't agree at all?
I don't agree on that point. I think probably what he was from where he was coming from was that he wants a cut in the rate, CRR rate. I think that is a more reasoned position to take from a banker's perspective.
That's also what C. Rangarajan, the PM's top economic advisor, has said recently, and he said, and I quote, that the rate of CRR should come down considerably, even more, and it should only be used as a monetary tool in case of extreme or exceptional circumstances. Is there a more viable sort of course to take?
The views expressed by Dr. Rangarajan expresses the sentiments of the government. The government is concerned about the falling growth, and it wants to spur growth, and one of the instruments of spurring growth is to increase liquidity in the market, and they feel that cut in the CRR will lead into increase of liquidity. But that is the government side. The fact remains that we are facing a very high inflation rate, and RBI, being a conservative organization, is thinking very cautiously, and for them, controlling inflation is a priority.
Is a top priority, right?
Is a matter of higher priority than thinking of growth.
Right.
Because RBI, I think, is very right in thinking that if you want to, spur growth, then you also need to look at fiscal responsibility.
Right.
Because government has failed to control fiscal deficit, and it has been revising its targets under the FRBM Act. And its track record in controlling subsidy is not exactly stellar.
Right. On that note, we'll go into our third story straight away, Himanshu. Now, get ready to shell out more from your pockets if you're a regular air traveler. Major Indian carriers have hiked the fuel surcharge on tickets, ranging from rupees 150 to 250 for domestic travel and rupees 825 for a one-way international ticket. Rahul Kapoor filed the story. Take a look. Following a 7.6% increase in jet fuel prices, air travel has become costlier, with major Indian carriers hiking fuel surcharge on tickets. Air India and Jet Airways have already introduced the increased fuel surcharge fares.
The operating cost of an aircraft, the major chunk is on the fuel. So if the international price of fuel has increased, here in our country, we do not have any option but to enhance the tariff so as to compensate the increase in fuel.
Post the surcharge hike, an increase of rupees 150 in the surcharge would be applicable on all sectors less than 1,000 kilometers and rupees 250 for those beyond that distance. A blanket hike of rupees 825 would be charged on all one-way international tickets as well. The domestic fuel surcharge for a distance of over 1,000 kilometers so far was rupees 3,250, which will now go up to rupees 3,500.
High airfares have been a major reason for domestic air travel to record its steepest fall in 7 years. While airlines blame the rising fuel cost for high airfares, Air Travel Estimates 2012-13 have forecast that passenger traffic growth this year would come down to 7% from earlier projections of 11%. With Athar, Rahul Kapoor for Rajya Sabha TV.
There you go. Get ready to shell out more if you want. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Himanshu Sinha, for joining us on Policy Watch this week. The first story on Policy Watch this week was the Shome panel, of course, recommended the deferment of GAAR by another 3 years. Industry is rejoicing. It's good news for industry as well as investors, both foreign and domestic. Of course, while it might not get money pumping in right away by FIIs, it will, like Parthasarthi Shome said to us, that create a better macro environment, a macro atmosphere for investment. Our second story this week on Policy Watch was the debate on CRR. Like Governor Subbarao said, he of course joked about it, and my guest as well thinks that doing away with the CRR is not perhaps the course we should take, but yes, getting the CRR rate down for a bit, and of course, like Mr. Rangarajan has suggested, only use CRR as a monetary tool in extreme and exceptional circumstances. That perhaps might be the middle path that everyone else is looking for. Our third story this week, of course, major airlines hiking fares. It is not good news for consumers, but of course, they they didn't really have too much of a choice with fuel surcharges and jet fuel becoming more expensive as well. We'll have to see how global crude acts and behaves to see whether or not those hikes can come down in the near future. That's all the time we have on Policy Watch this week. So Athar saying goodbye, good night, and thanks for watching.